"The gun," replied Barbicane, "can be manufactured, the powder can be made, neither metals, saltpeter, nor coal can fail in the depths of the moon, and we need only go 8,000 leagues in order to fall upon the terrestrial globe by virtue of the mere laws of weight." "Enough," said Michel with animation. "Let it be no longer a question of returning. We have already entertained it too long as to communicating with our former earthly colleagues. That will not be difficult." "And how?" "By means of meteors launched by lunar volcanoes." "Well thought of, Michel," said Barbicane in a convinced tone of voice. "Laplace has calculated that a force 5 times greater than that of our gun would suffice to send a meteor from the moon to the earth, and there is not one volcano which has not a greater power of propulsion than that." "Hurrah!" exclaimed Michel. "These meteors are handy postmen and cost nothing, and how we shall be able to laugh at the post office administration. But now I think of it." "What do you think of?" "A capital idea. Why did we not fasten a thread to our projectile, and we could have exchanged telegrams with the earth?" "The deuce," answered Nicole. "Do you consider the weight of a thread, 250,000 miles long, nothing?" "As nothing, they could have trebled the Columbiad's charge. They could have quadrupled or quintupled it," exclaimed Michel, with whom the verb took a higher intonation each time. "There is but one little objection to make to your proposition," replied Barbicane, "which is that, during the rotary motion of the globe, our thread would have wound itself round it like a chain on a capstan, and that it would inevitably have brought us to the ground." "By the 39 stars of the Union," said Michel, "I have nothing but impracticable ideas today. Ideas worthy of J.T. Maston, but I have a notion that, if we do not return to Earth, J.T. Maston will be able to come to us." "Yes, he'll come," replied Barbicane. "He is a worthy and a courageous comrade. Besides, what is easier? Is not the Columbiad still buried in the soil of Florida? Is cotton and nitric acid wanted, wherewith to manufacture the pyroxyle? Will not the moon pass the zenith of Florida? In 18 years' time, will she not occupy exactly the same place as today?" "Yes," continued Michel, "yes, Maston will come, and with him our friends Elphinstone, Blomsbury, all the members of the gun club, and they will be well received, and by they will run trains of projectiles between the earth and the moon." "Hurrah for J.T. Maston!" It is probable that, if the Hon. J.T. Maston did not hear the hurrahs uttered in his honor, his ears at least tingled. What was he doing then? Doubtless, posted in the Rocky Mountains at the station of Long's Peak, he was trying to find the invisible projectile gravitating in space. If he was thinking of his dear companions, we must allow that they were not far behind him, and that, under the influence of a strange excitement, they were devoting to him their best thoughts. But whence this excitement, which was evidently growing upon the tenants of the projectile? Their sobriety could not be doubted. This strange irritation of the brain, must it be attributed to the peculiar circumstances under which they found themselves, to their proximity to the orb of night, from which only a few hours separated them, to some secret influence of the moon acting upon their nervous system? Their faces were as rosy as if they had been exposed to the roaring flames of an oven. Their voices resounded in loud accents. Their words escaped like a champagne cork driven out by carbonic acid. Their gestures became annoying. They wanted so much room to perform them. And, strange to say, they none of them noticed this great tension of the mind. Now, said Nicole in a short tone, now that I do not know whether we shall ever return from the moon, I want to know what we are going to do there. What we are going to do there, replied Barbicane, stamping with his foot as if he was in a fencing saloon. I do not know. You do not know, exclaimed Michel with a bellow, which provoked a sonorous echo in the projectile. No, I have not even thought about it, retorted Barbicane in the same loud tone. Well, I know, replied Michel. Speak, then, cried Nicole, who could no longer contain the growling of his voice. I shall speak, if it suits me, exclaimed Michel, seizing his companion's arms with violence. It must suit you, said Barbicane, with an eye on fire, and a threatening hand. It was you who drew us into this frightful journey, and we want to know what for. Yes, said the captain, now that I do not know where I am going, I want to know why I am going. Why? Exclaimed Michel, jumping a yard high. Why? To take possession of the moon, in the name of the United States. To add a 40th state to the Union, to colonize the lunar regions. To cultivate them, to people them, to transport thither all the prodigies of art, of science, and industry. To civilize the Selenites, unless they are more civilized than we are, and to constitute them a republic, if they are not already one. And if there are no Selenites, retorted Nicole, who, under the influence of this unaccountable intoxication, was very contradictory. Who said that there were no Selenites? Exclaimed Michel in a threatening tone. I do, howled Nicole. Captain, said Michel, do not repeat that insolence, or I will knock your teeth down your throat. The two adversaries were going to fall upon each other, and the incoherent discussion threatened to merge into a fight, when Barbicane intervened with one bound. Stop, miserable men, said he, separating his two companions. If there are no Selenites, we will do without them. Yes, exclaimed Michel, who was not particular. Yes, we will do without them. We have only to make Selenites. Down with the Selenites. The empire of the moon belongs to us, said Nicole. Let us three constitute the republic. I will be the Congress, cried Michel. And I the Senate, retorted Nicole. And Barbicane, the president, howled Michel. Not the president elected by the nation, replied Barbicane. Very well, a president elected by the Congress, cried Michel. And as I am the Congress, you are unanimously elected. Hurrah, 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 for President Barbicane, exclaimed Nicole. Hip, 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 vociferated Michel Ardan. Then the President and the Senate struck up in a tremendous voice the popular song Yankee Doodle, while from the Congress resounded the masculine tones of the Marseillaise. Then they struck up a frantic dance, with maniacal gestures, idiotic stampings, and somersaults like those of the boneless clowns in the circus. Diana, joining in the dance, and howling in her turn, jumped to the top of the projectile. An unaccountable flapping of wings was then heard amid most fantastic cock crows, while 5 or 6 hens fluttered like bats against the walls. Then the 3 traveling companions, acted upon by some unaccountable influence, above that of intoxication, inflamed by the air, which had set their respiratory apparatus on fire, fell motionless to the bottom of the projectile. Chapter 8. 8078,000 500 and 14 leagues. What had happened, whence the cause of this singular intoxication, the consequences of which might have been very disastrous? A simple blunder of Michel's, which, fortunately, Nicole was able to correct in time. After a perfect swoon, which lasted some minutes, the captain, recovering first, soon collected his scattered senses. Although he had breakfasted only 2 hours before, he felt a gnawing hunger, as if he had not eaten anything for several days. Everything about him, stomach and brain, were overexcited to the highest degree. He got up and demanded from Michel a supplementary repast. Michel, utterly done up, did not answer. Nicole then tried to prepare some tea, destined to help the absorption of a dozen sandwiches. He first tried to get some fire, and struck a match sharply. What was his surprise to see the sulphur shine with so extraordinary a brilliancy, as to be almost unbearable to the eye. From the gas burner, which he lit, rose a flame equal to a jet of electric light. A revelation dawned on Nicole's mind, that intensity of light, the physiological troubles which had arisen in him, the overexcitement of all his moral and quarrelsome faculties. Understood all. The oxygen, he exclaimed, and leaning over the air apparatus, he saw that the tap was allowing the colorless gas to escape freely, life-giving, but in its pure state producing the gravest disorders in the system. Michel had blunderingly opened the tap of the apparatus to the full. Nicole hastened to stop the escape of oxygen, with which the atmosphere was saturated, which would have been the death of the travelers, not by suffocation, but by combustion. An hour later, the air less charged with it restored the lungs to their normal condition. By degrees the three friends recovered from their intoxication, but they were obliged to sleep themselves sober over their oxygen as a drunkard does over his wine. When Michel learned his share of the responsibility of this incident, he was not much disconcerted. This unexpected drunkenness broke the monotony of the journey. Many foolish things had been said while under its influence, but also quickly forgotten. And then, added the merry Frenchman, I am not sorry to have tasted a little of this heady gas. Do you know, my friends, that a curious establishment might be founded with rooms of oxygen, where people whose system is weakened could for a few hours live a more active life, fancy parties, where the room was saturated with this heroic fluid, theaters where it should be kept at high pressure. What passion in the souls of the actors and spectators! What fire, what enthusiasm! And if, instead of an assembly, only a whole people could be saturated, what activity in its functions, what a supplement to life it would derive from an exhausted nation! They might make a great and strong one, and I know more than one state in old Europe which ought to put itself under the regime of oxygen for the sake of its health. Michel spoke with so much animation that one might have fancied that the tap was still to open, but a few words from Barbicane soon shattered his enthusiasm. That is all very well, friend Michel, said he, but will you inform us where these chickens came from which have mixed themselves up in our concert? Those chickens? Yes, indeed, half a dozen chickens and a fine cock were walking about, flapping their wings and chattering. Ah, the awkward things, exclaimed Michel, the oxygen has made them revolt. But what do you want to do with these chickens? Asked Barbicane. To acclimatize them in the moon, by Jove. Then why did you hide them? A joke, my worthy president, a simple joke, which has proved a miserable failure. I wanted to set them free on the lunar continent, without saying anything. Oh, what would have been your amazement, on seeing these earthly winged animals pecking in your lunar fields? You rascal, you unmitigated rascal, replied Barbicane. You do not want oxygen to mount to the head. You are always what we were under the influence of the gas. You are always foolish. Oh, who says that we were not wise then? Replied Michel Ardan. After this philosophical reflection, the three friends set about restoring the order of the projectile. Chickens and cock were reinstated in their coop, but while proceeding with this operation, Barbicane and his two companions had a most desired perception of a new phenomenon. From the moment of leaving the earth, their own weight, that of the projectile, and the objects it enclosed, had been subject to an increasing diminution. If they could not prove this loss of the projectile, a moment would arrive when it would be sensibly felt upon themselves, and the utensils and instruments they used. It is needless to say that a scale would not show this loss, for the weight destined to weight the object would have lost exactly as much as the object itself. But a spring steelyard, for example, the tension of which was independent of the attraction, would have given a just estimate of this loss. We know that the attraction, otherwise called the weight, is in proportion to the densities of the bodies, and inversely as the squares of the distances. Hence this effect, if the Earth had been alone in space, if the other celestial bodies had been suddenly annihilated, the projectile, according to Newton's laws, would weigh less as it got farther from the Earth, but without ever losing its weight entirely, for the terrestrial attraction would always have made itself felt at whatever distance. But, in reality, a time must come when the projectile would no longer be subject to the law of weight, after allowing for the other celestial bodies, whose effect could not be set down as zero. Indeed, the projectile's course was being traced between the Earth and the Moon, as it distanced the Earth. The terrestrial attraction diminished, but the lunar attraction rose in proportion. There must come a point where these two attractions would neutralize each other. The projectile would possess weight no longer. If the Moon's and the Earth's densities had been equal, this point would have been at an equal distance between the two orbs. But taking the different densities into consideration, it was easy to reckon that this point would be situated at 47/60ths of the whole journey, i.e. at 78,514 leagues from the Earth. At this point, a body having no principle of speed or displacement in itself would remain immovable forever, being attracted equally by both orbs, and not being drawn more toward one than toward the other. Now, if the projectile's impulsive force had been correctly calculated, it would attain this point without speed, having lost all trace of weight, as well as all the objects within it. What would happen then? Three hypotheses presented themselves. 1. Either it would retain a certain amount of motion, and pass the point of equal attraction, and fall upon the Moon, by virtue of the excess of the lunar attraction over the terrestrial. 2. Or, its speed failing and unable to reach the point of equal attraction, it would fall upon the Moon, by virtue of the excess of the lunar attraction over the terrestrial. 3. Or, lastly, animated with sufficient speed to enable it to reach the neutral point, but not sufficient to pass it, it would remain forever suspended in that spot like the pretended tomb of Mahomet, between the zenith and the nadir. Such was their situation, and Barbicane clearly explained the consequences to his traveling companions, which greatly interested them. But how should they know, when the projectile had reached this neutral point situated at that distance, especially when neither themselves, nor the objects enclosed in the projectile, would be any longer subject to the laws of weight. Up to this time, the travelers, while admitting that this action was constantly decreasing, had not yet become sensible to its total absence. But that day, about 11 o'clock in the morning, Nickel having accidentally let a glass slip from his hand, the glass, instead of falling, remained suspended in the air. "Ah," exclaimed Michel Ardan, "that is rather an amusing piece of natural philosophy." And immediately divers other objects, firearms and bottles, abandoned to themselves, held themselves up as by enchantment. Diana took placed in space by Michel, reproduced, but without any trick, the wonderful suspension practiced by Caston and Robert Houdin. Indeed, the dog did not seem to know that she was floating in air. The three adventurous companions were surprised and stupefied. Despite their scientific reasonings, they felt themselves being carried into the domain of wonders. They felt that weight was really wanting to their bodies. If they stretched out their arms, they did not attempt to fall. Their heads shook on their shoulders. Their feet no longer clung to the floor of the projectile. They were like drunken men, having no stability in themselves. Fancy has depicted men without reflection, others without shadow, but here reality, by the neutralizations of attractive forces, produced men in whom nothing had any weight, and who weighed nothing themselves. Suddenly, Michel, taking a spring, left the floor, and remained suspended in the air, like Murillot's monk of the Cuisine des Anges. The two friends joined him instantly, and all three formed a miraculous ascension, in the center of the projectile. "Is it to be believed? Is it probable? Is it possible?" exclaimed Michel, "and yet it is so. Ah! If Raphael had seen us thus, what an assumption he would have thrown upon canvas." "The assumption cannot last," replied Barbicane. "If the projectile passes the neutral point, the lunar attraction will draw us to the moon. Then our feet will be upon the roof," replied Michel. "No," said Barbicane, "because the projectile's center of gravity is very low. It will only turn by degrees. Then all our portables will be upset from top to bottom. That is a fact." "Calm yourself, Michel," replied Nickel. "No upset is to be feared. Not a thing will move, for the projectile's evolution will be imperceptible." "Just so," continued Barbicane, "and when it has passed the point of equal attraction, its base, being the heavier, will draw it perpendicularly to the moon. But, in order that this phenomenon should take place, we must have passed the neutral line." "Pass the neutral line," cried Michel. "Then let us do as the sailors do, when they cross the equator." A slight side movement brought Michel back, toward the padded side. Thence he took a bottle and glasses, placed them in space before his companions, and, drinking merrily, they saluted the line with a triple hurrah. The influence of these attractions scarcely lasted an hour. The travelers felt themselves insensibly drawn toward the floor, and Barbicane fancied that the conical end of the projectile was varying a little from its normal direction toward the moon. By an inverse motion the base was approaching first. The lunar attraction was prevailing over the terrestrial. The fall toward the moon was beginning, almost imperceptibly as yet, but by degrees the attractive force would become stronger. The fall would be more decided. The projectile, drawn by its base, would turn its cone to the earth, and fall with ever-increasing speed, onto the surface of the Selenite continent. Their destination would then be attained. Now nothing could prevent the success of their enterprise, and Nicole and Michel Ardan shared Barbicane's joy. Then they chatted of all the phenomena, which had astonished them one after the other, particularly the neutralization of the laws of weight, Michel Ardan, always enthusiastic, drew conclusions which were purely fanciful. "Ah, my worthy friends," he exclaimed, "what progress we should make if on earth we could throw off some of that weight, some of that chain, which binds us to her. It would be the prisoner set at liberty, no more fatigue of either arms or legs. Or, if it is true, that in order to fly on the earth's surface, to keep oneself suspended in the air, merely by the play of the muscles, there requires a strength 150 times greater than that which we possess, a simple act of volition, a caprice, would bear us into space, if attraction did not exist." "Just so," said Nicole, smiling. "If we could succeed in suppressing weight, as they suppress pain by anesthesia, that would change the face of modern society." "Yes," cried Michel, full of his subject, "destroy weight, and no more burdens." "Well said," replied Barbicane, "but if nothing had any weight, nothing would keep in its place, not even your hat on your head, worthy Michel, nor your house, whose stones only adhere by weight, nor a boat, whose stability on the waves is only caused by weight, not even the ocean, whose waves would no longer be equalized by terrestrial attraction, and lastly, not even the atmosphere, whose atoms, being no longer held in their places, would disperse in space." "That is tiresome," retorted Michel. "Nothing like these matter-of-fact people, for bringing one back to the bare reality." "But console yourself, Michel," continued Barbicane, "for if no orb exists from whence all laws of weight are banished, you are at least going to visit one, where it is much less than on the earth."